Hollywood sold these stars as safe, clean, familiar, the boy next door, the trusted hero, the lovable neighbor. But behind those family-friendly images sat fear, studio pressure, gossip columns, and careers that could crack the second private truth-threatened public fantasy. In story after story, the same pattern appears. The image made them famous, and that same image trapped them inside a lie they were never allowed to control. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are tonight. Tab Hunter. Hollywood sold him as the wholesome dream, and then forced the man inside it to disappear. In the 1950s, he was the all-American golden boy, a Warner Brothers heartthrob with clean features, a hit record, teen magazine adoration, and a public image designed to feel safe for the whole family. He starred in films like Battle Cry, The Burning Hills, and Damn Yankees, and fan culture treated him less like an actor than a national crush. That image was the product, but the private life behind it was never allowed the same freedom. Hunter later wrote openly about being gay, and his memoir confirmed what had long circulated as industry rumor. Long before that honesty, scandal coverage had already started pressing against the fantasy. In 1955, Confidential revived news of a 1950 disorderly conduct arrest and wrapped it in innuendo. Several accounts also connect that coverage to the vicious economy of 1950s scandal magazines, where publicity men, gossip brokers, and studios all tried to manage which secrets exploded and which stayed buried. Even when the article did not immediately destroy his popularity, the message was clear. Hollywood could market his face, but his real life had to stay under control. Here's the cruel part. Hunter's appeal depended on innocence, yet innocence was the one thing the system would never grant him privately. He had to perform normalcy while others managed the panic, the dating image expectations, and the fear that one whisper could become a headline. And that is why his story belongs first. The same machine that made him beloved also taught every star behind him what could happen if the illusion slipped. Sal Mineo. He entered Hollywood as the sensitive outsider audiences could not forget. In Rebel Without a Cause, his performance as Plato made him an Oscar nominee while still a teenager, and for a moment he looked like one of the most emotionally vivid young actors of his generation. He followed that with major work in Giant and Exodus, earning a second Oscar nomination for the latter. On paper, that should have been the foundation of a long and serious career. Then the promise began to thin out. By the early 1960s, Mineo was no longer the fresh-faced adolescent Hollywood had first packaged. At the same time, rumors about his sexuality grew louder around town. Some later biographies and archival accounts say those rumors made studios view him as risky for conventional leading man roles. Mineo himself spoke about how quickly interest dried up. One minute, opportunities were there. Then they were not. Instead of growing naturally into adult stardom, he was pushed toward parts the industry considered safer, stranger, or smaller. That does not mean every career setback can be reduced to one cause. Age, changing tastes, and typecasting mattered too. But several accounts connect the whisper campaign around his private life to the shrinking space he was given. So his chapter feels tragic in a quieter way than Tab Hunter's. There was no single thunderclap, just doors closing. Fewer chances. A career drifting away from what once seemed possible, even as he kept working on stage, on television, and in riskier material. And that is the bitter irony. The same sensitivity that made him unforgettable also left him exposed in an industry that punished any image it could no longer neatly sell. Rock Hudson. He was the fantasy Hollywood thought it could control forever. He was tall, handsome, masculine, and so dominant as a leading man that his name became shorthand for old studio glamour. Giant, magnificent obsession, all that heaven allows. Pillow talk. For years, he represented the kind of reassuring male star audiences were trained to trust without question. Even people who never followed celebrity gossip understood the image immediately. Strong, romantic, unshakable, but his private life sat under a layer of management almost as famous as the image itself. His sexuality was widely rumored inside the industry, even while fan magazines and publicity machinery protected the straight romantic myth. Some accounts describe arranged dates, strategic publicity, and the constant work of maintaining a public story that would preserve his bankability. That contradiction was not incidental. It was the structure. Hollywood wanted the profits of his image without allowing the man to exist openly inside it. Then came the catastrophe that changed public memory. In 1985, Hudson announced he had AIDS, and he died only months later. Britannica notes that his death dramatically increased public awareness of the disease. The cultural shock was enormous, partly because the old fantasy still clung to him. America was not just confronting illness, it was confronting the lie that a star like Rock Hudson had been forced to live inside for decades. Here's the cruel part. Even in tragedy, the public often treated the revelation as scandal first and humanity second. And that is why his story lands like an emotional escalation point. The image that made him one of Hollywood's strongest symbols of masculinity also became one of the most punishing cages in screen history. George Takei. His story hurts in a different way because it is not only about destruction, it is also about endurance. To television audiences, he was Mr. Sulu from Star Trek, a calm and intelligent presence in one of the most beloved franchises in popular culture. That role made him familiar, respectable, and easy to welcome into American living rooms. But for decades, much of his personal life remained tightly guarded because the industry had trained people like him to calculate every risk. Takei officially discussed his sexuality publicly in 2005, explaining that this was less a sudden revelation than the end of a very long corridor. He has also said he stayed quiet for years, partly out of fear that openness could damage his career. By then, he had already spent decades navigating Hollywood while carrying that pressure in private. The silence covered not only identity, but a long-term relationship with Brad Altman and a life that could not be fully spoken in public without consequence. What makes his chapter reflective instead of purely catastrophic is what came after. He did not vanish. He became a visible LGBTQ advocate, spoke openly about his life, and turned delayed honesty into public purpose. That later activism matters because it shows what survival can look like after decades of restraint. There is survival here. There is patience. But there is also loss, because freedom arrived after so many years of caution. That is the irony. The familiar, trustworthy face that made him welcome in America's living rooms was also a face forced to hide. Hollywood did not destroy him in one spectacular collapse. It simply made honesty wait far too long. Raymond Burr. He was not sold as a teen idol or a matinee dream. He was sold as something even more durable: trust. As Perry Mason, he became the grave, intelligent defender audiences welcomed into their homes week after week. Later, Ironside reinforced that authority. His image had enormous value because it felt stable, paternal, and reliable. He was the kind of television star viewers believed, which is why his private mythology feels so startling in retrospect. Multiple biographical accounts say Burr protected a heterosexual public image through elaborate personal stories, including tragic tales about a wife and child that could not be verified. At the same time, he shared a long life with Robert Benavides, who later spoke openly about their partnership and their years together in business and at home. The distance between the public legend and the private reality was not small. It was structural. That does not mean every detail told about Burr over the years can be accepted without caution. Some claims remain contested or filtered through biography rather than Burr's own public confession. But the broader pattern is well documented. The image had to be managed, protected, and kept emotionally legible to mainstream television audiences. Burr was hardly the only star to be packaged this way, but the scale of the construction around him makes his case especially striking. Here's the shock. Burr played certainty for a living while his own identity had to remain uncertain in public. The trusted image made him powerful, but it also demanded performance far beyond the courtroom set. The mask was part of the brand, and the brand was never supposed to break. Richard Chamberlain. He embodied romantic fantasy so completely that the role nearly swallowed the man. Dr. Kildare turned him into a television heartthrob in the 1960s, and later successes like Shogun and The Thornbirds kept him associated with noble, desirable leading men. He was admired precisely because he fit a dream audiences wanted to believe, and that popularity was measurable in ratings, magazine covers, records, and huge volumes of fan mail. But Chamberlain later described the emotional cost of living inside that dream while hiding his sexuality. He was publicly outed by a French magazine in 1989, yet did not confirm he was gay until his 2003 memoir, Shattered Love. By then, he had spent decades protecting a career built on heterosexual fantasy and mass female adoration. Reuters and later obituaries emphasized that he stayed closeted for fear it would damage his career, which says almost everything about the rules he had internalized. That long silence is the story. Not because it makes him mysterious, but because it reveals how fear reshapes a life. Chamberlain later spoke with unusual honesty about self-loathing, anxiety, and the relief that finally came with openness. The loneliness in that arc is hard to ignore. He was famous for playing romantic truth while privately fearing truth itself, and that contradiction had to be carried year after year. And that is the trap. The image that made him desirable also taught him that honesty might cost him the very career that image created. George Maharis. He looked built for television stardom. On Route 66, he played Buzz Murdoch with enough toughness and vulnerability to become one of the early 1960s most recognizable TV faces. He earned an Emmy nomination, sang pop records on the side, and seemed positioned for a long leading man run. At his peak, he looked like exactly the kind of rugged but accessible star television could keep for years. His career was already shaken by conflict around Route 66, illness, and a bruising split from the show. After leaving, he battled with producers publicly, and the sense of momentum never fully recovered, but later scandal made the damage worse. Maharis was arrested in 1967 and again in the 1970s in cases tied to sex-related charges involving public restrooms. Contemporary and later accounts note that the major charges were reduced or dismissed, so the framing matters. Still, the public record itself was enough to stain the image, and old television fame was unusually vulnerable to that kind of moral panic. Then the phone stopped ringing the same way. Maybe not instantly in every corner of the industry, but enough to change the trajectory. For a star whose value depended on broad public acceptability, public scandal could be fatal. In Maharis's case, many observers have treated those episodes as a major reason his leading man future collapsed, even if earlier career disruptions had already weakened the foundation. That is the cruelty. The road trip hero who looked made for motion suddenly found his image frozen by scandal, suspicion, and a culture eager to moralize. Amanda Bearse. Her story closes this list because it proves the system did not vanish when Hollywood became more modern. To millions of viewers, she was the sharp, hilarious neighbor on Married, with Children, one of the most familiar sitcom faces of her era. She also directed dozens of episodes of the series, which already hints at something important. Actors who feel exposed in front of the camera often start building safety somewhere else. Bearse later became one of the first primetime sitcom actresses to come out publicly while still on a series. That mattered. So did the risk around it. Later interviews and LGBTQ press accounts describe her coming out as something shaped partly by tabloid pressure. While Bearse herself has spoken about Hollywood prejudice, sexism, ageism, and the need to build directing work that gave her more control and less exposure. In other words, the punishment was not always one giant public collapse. Sometimes it was a narrowing, a cooling, a shift in who gets considered safe, marketable, or easy to cast. That makes her the right final chapter, more recent, more reflective, less coded than old studio Hollywood, but not free of image management either. The wholesome face changed. The trap did not disappear overnight. These stars were sold as comfort, but punished for honesty. Were they surviving the only way they could, or should Hollywood have been forced to change much sooner? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories.